I found the number on a Tuesday in October, 3 weeks after they sent me home. My name is Nathan. I'm 44 years old. I'm a civil engineer, and I was sitting at the kitchen table in my bathrobe at 10 in the morning because that was still the extent of what my body could manage. The walk from the bedroom to the kitchen, the slow lowering into a chair, the careful arrangement of a man who had spent 11 weeks in Fallow Ridge General learning what it feels like when your own organs turn against you. Acute pancreatitis, complicated by infection. The kind of illness that arrives without warning and takes everything at once before it releases you. Claudia had left her phone on the table when she went upstairs to shower. She'd asked me to listen for it in case her mother called. I wasn't snooping. That matters to me, even now. I picked it up because it buzzed, and because it buzzed with a name I didn't recognize. R, just the single letter, no surname, the kind of contact saved with deliberate minimalism. And the preview text read, "Thinking about you this morning." I sat with that for a moment. Then I went to the call log. 47 outgoing calls to the same number over 11 weeks. The dates began in late July, 2 weeks after I was admitted. They ran through September, clustered on evenings and occasional weekend afternoons, ending abruptly on the day I came home. 11 weeks. 47 calls. I set the phone face down on the table and looked out the kitchen window at the backyard, where the oak tree we'd planted the year Marcus was born had gone orange at the edges in the October cool. I'd missed the whole summer from a hospital bed. I'd missed the tree going green and full, and now I was watching it turn from a kitchen chair I could barely get to without stopping to breathe. I heard Claudia's shower shut off upstairs. I turned the phone back over and took a photograph of the call log with my own phone. My hands were steadier than I expected. By the time she came downstairs, I had moved to the living room and was reading the newspaper the way I always read it, or the way I used to, before the hospital, before the weight I hadn't regained yet, before everything. She brought me coffee without being asked and set it on the table beside my chair and touched my shoulder as she passed. "Your mom didn't call," I said. "She will," Claudia said. "She's slow in the mornings." She picked up her phone from the table. She didn't check it, just slipped it into her pocket the way you slip something into your pocket when you're relieved it's still where you left it. I drank my coffee and said nothing. But something had already shifted in the room. Some load-bearing thing, invisible, cracked through, and I was the only one who knew it yet. I should go back to before the hospital. Before July. Claudia and I had been married 16 years. She was a dental practice office manager, organized, socially fluent, the kind of person who remembered every staff birthday and kept the waiting room feeling like somewhere you didn't mind being. We had Marcus, who was 14 and in that particular phase of adolescence where he was simultaneously easier and stranger than he'd been as a child, quieter, more interior, occasionally surprising. We had the house on Ember Street with the oak tree and the porch that needed repainting and the kitchen where we'd had every significant conversation of our marriage. The marriage was good. I want to say that clearly, not as a defense, but as a fact. We weren't struggling. We didn't have the kind of accumulated distance that people sometimes describe as a precondition. The separate bedrooms, the parallel silences, the feeling of two people sharing a space without sharing anything else. We had dinner together most nights. We talked. Claudia laughed easily, and I made her laugh often, and that had always seemed like a reliable indicator of something real. I got sick on a Saturday morning in mid-July. The pain started around 4 a.m., a deep, pressing thing under my ribs that I tried to attribute to bad food, then couldn't anymore. By 7 I was in the car. By noon I was in surgery. The details of the 11 weeks are not the story I want to tell. The procedures, the complications, the infection that set everything back by 3 weeks, the particular humiliation of a strong man who cannot stand without assistance. Those details exist, but they belong to a different account. What matters here is the shape of what was happening at home while I was not there. I didn't know the shape of it then. What I understand now, looking back at those first weeks in the hospital, is that I was entirely focused on surviving, which is the appropriate focus for someone who is trying to survive. And that focus made me, for the first time in our marriage, genuinely absent. Not distracted. Absent. I couldn't manage what was happening at home from a hospital bed with a drain in my side. I had to trust that what I'd built would hold without me tending it. That trust was not irrational, but it was incomplete, and the incompleteness had a cost I didn't know I was paying. Claudia visited every day for the first 3 weeks. She brought things, books I'd mentioned wanting, the good headphones from my desk, a photograph of Marcus that she taped to the wall beside my bed. She sat with me for hours. She held my hand during the worst nights. In the second week, when the infection was at its worst and the doctors were careful in the way doctors are careful when the news is not good, she cried in the hallway, and Drew told me about it later. My older brother, who drove up from Savannah and stayed the first 2 weeks. In the fourth week, the visits shortened. I attributed it to the demands of running a household alone, Marcus's school schedule, the practice she managed, the accumulation of logistics that a hospitalized husband leaves behind. She still came, but she came for an hour instead of 3, and she was sometimes distracted in a way I also attributed to exhaustion. I was grateful she came at all. I told her that. One evening in the 5th week, a nurse named Patrice came in for my evening check and mentioned, with the mild tone of someone making conversation, that my wife seemed tired. She was in the waiting room for a while before she came up, Patrice said. On her phone the whole time. I said Claudia had a demanding job. Patrice nodded and noted my vitals and left. I thought about it for about 30 seconds and then thought about something else. That detail, Claudia in the waiting room, on her phone for an extended period before coming up, is one I've returned to many times. Not because it was obviously suspicious at the time, but because of what it looks like now. She was 40 feet away and 40 minutes early, and she spent that time on her phone rather than coming upstairs. At the time, I had an explanation ready. She was handling something for work. She was giving me time to rest. She didn't want to wake me. Every explanation was available and benign. I chose the most benign one without examining the others. My brother Drew left in week 3. He had his own life, his own job, and I was stable enough that his presence wasn't medically necessary. Before he left, he stood by my bed and said, "Claudia okay?" "She seems." He stopped. "Stressed?" I offered. "Yeah," he said. "Stressed." He hugged me carefully, the way you hug someone with a drain in their side, and drove back to Savannah. Drew would tell me later, months later, that he had noticed something he couldn't name in the first weeks. A quality of distraction in Claudia that read to him as more than fatigue. He'd said nothing because he wasn't certain, because I was sick, because the threshold for saying that particular thing to a man in a hospital bed is very high. I understood. I didn't blame him. Marcus came on Sundays, and sometimes Wednesdays after school. He was 14, and hospitals made him uncomfortable in the way hospitals make adolescents uncomfortable. The smell, the equipment, the diminished version of a parent they didn't know how to talk to. He sat with me, and we watched whatever was on, and he told me about school in the abbreviated way teenagers summarize their interior lives for parents they love but don't fully let in. I was glad for every visit. He mentioned once, in August, that mom had a new friend from work. "What's his name?" I asked. Marcus shrugged. "Rob, I think. He came over for dinner. Just the two of them. And me," he said. I didn't really talk to him. A man named Rob. A dinner at the house. Marcus present, which made it feel formal and explainable. I filed it under Claudia maintaining her social life while I was gone and felt, if anything, a mild gratitude that she wasn't isolating herself. I was wrong about what I was filing. I came home on a Thursday in late September. The house looked the same and felt subtly different in the way that spaces feel different when you've been away from them during a significant period of their life. The kitchen had been rearranged slightly. The coffee maker moved to the other counter, a new plant on the windowsill that I didn't recognize. The living room had a throw blanket on the couch that wasn't ours, a dark gray wool thing that Claudia said she'd bought from a boutique downtown. Marcus had new sneakers and a new phone case, and the particular energy of a teenager who has had more autonomy than usual and isn't sure how to recalibrate now that a parent is home. Claudia was warm, attentive in the way of someone who has been preparing for a return. She had cleaned thoroughly, stocked the refrigerator with things I liked, set up the spare room as a recovery space so I could sleep without disturbing her if I had a difficult night. It was considerate and practical, and I was genuinely touched by it. I was also, from the moment I walked through the door, reading everything differently than I would have a month before. The photograph of the call log was on my phone. 47 calls to R, beginning July 26th, ending September 25th, the day I came home. Ending the day I came home. I said nothing. I watched. The first week home, I noticed the phone behavior I would have noticed in February if I'd been looking for it. Claudia had always left her phone accessible, on the counter, on the coffee table. Now it traveled with her room to room in the particular way phones travel with people when they contain something requiring management. She texted in the kitchen while I was in the living room. She took calls in the backyard, standing near the fence, back half turned. One evening I heard her laugh on one of those calls, a particular laugh, relaxed and genuine, the kind that comes out when you're comfortable with someone. She came back inside with the neutral expression of a person transitioning between registers. "Who was that?" I asked. "Donna from the practice," she said. "Office drama." I nodded. The gray throw blanket was still on the couch. I turned it over one afternoon when Claudia was at work. No tag, no label, a quality item, soft, the kind of thing that cost real money. "The boutique downtown," she'd said. I Googled boutiques in Fallow Ridge. There were two. Neither of them sold home goods. That blanket was the second flag I let pass. I'd already decided, by some mechanism I didn't consciously control, that I needed more before I was willing to see what was already in front of me. I wasn't protecting her. I was protecting myself, the version of my life that I'd come home to, that I needed to be real while I was still too weak to absorb the alternative. Marcus was watching me that week. 14-year-olds are perceptive in ways they can't always articulate. They read the emotional weather of a household the way animals read pressure changes. He was quieter than usual around both of us. Not sullen. Careful. Once, passing me in the hallway, he put his hand briefly on my arm. A small, uncharacteristic gesture that I stored away without examining. I was getting stronger. Slowly, by degrees measured in how far I could walk without stopping, how long I could sit upright, whether I needed the afternoon rest. The body had its own timeline, and I was following it. But my mind, freed from the singular focus of survival, had begun doing what minds do when they have enough space to move, connecting things. Rob. The dinner in August. A man named Rob who had come to the house while I was in the hospital, eaten at my table, sat across from my son. I thought about her in the contact list. I pulled up the call log photograph again. I looked at the number. I didn't call it. Not yet. I wrote it down. In the second week home, I was well enough to drive short distances. I told Claudia I was going to the hardware store for something I didn't need and drove instead to Soren's house. Soren was a colleague and, over 15 years, something closer, the kind of friend you make in middle age who knows you well without requiring the maintenance of a younger friendship. He was divorced, lived alone, and had a quality of quiet reliability that I needed more than almost anything else that week. I told him everything. The call log, the blanket, the way the phone traveled, Rob's dinner. He listened without interrupting. When I finished, he said, "What do you need from me?" "I need someone who knows," I said. "And I need to think out loud." He poured coffee. We sat at his kitchen table for 2 hours. What I worked out in those 2 hours, I had circumstantial evidence and a pattern, but nothing definitive. The call log was damning, but not conclusive. 47 calls to an unknown contact could, in a defense argument, be explained as a friendship formed during a stressful period. The blanket was suspicious, but unprovable. The dinner was a fact, but not an indictment. What I needed was either a direct confrontation with what I had, or something more concrete. I thought about Marcus saying Rob, I think. I thought about a man who came to dinner in August and sat across from my 14-year-old son. There's a particular kind of anger that doesn't announce itself immediately. It arrives later, when you've had time to understand the full geometry of what happened. Sitting at Soren's table, I felt, for the first time, genuinely angry, not at the betrayal in the abstract, but at that specific detail. While I was in a hospital bed with a drain in my side, a man had sat at my dinner table and eaten food in front of my son. That was not a private thing between Claudia and whoever Rob was. That was something done in the middle of my family. And Marcus had been there for all of it. Soren suggested I speak to Drew. I called Drew that evening from the car, parked in the Soren's driveway. Drew picked up on the second ring, and I told him I needed to know what he'd seen in those first weeks. What the thing was that he couldn't name. A long pause. "There was a man," Drew said. "I saw him once in the parking lot at the hospital. He was leaving when I was arriving. I didn't know him. But the way Claudia was, when she came up afterward, she had a quality about her, like she'd just finished a conversation that had cost her something emotionally." He stopped. I told myself I was reading into it. I told myself you were sick, and I had no business making it worse. "What did he look like?" I asked. Drew described him. Medium height, 40 or so, dark jacket. He'd watched Claudia come through the hospital entrance, and there had been a moment between them in the lobby, a brief exchange, close together, that Drew had seen through the glass. In the parking lot of the hospital, while I was upstairs, I sat with that for a while. Then I called the number from the photograph. It rang 4 times. A man's voice. Yeah? Is this Rob? I said. A pause. Who's this? Nathan, I said. Claudia's husband. The line went quiet for 3 full seconds. I think you should talk to your wife, he said, and hung up. I drove home. I made dinner. The simple things I could still manage: pasta with sauce from a jar, bread from the bakery. Marcus ate at the table and talked about a project at school. Claudia ate and asked about my afternoon, and I said the hardware store hadn't had what I needed. She said she'd pick it up tomorrow. After Marcus went to his room, we washed the dishes side by side in the way we'd washed them for 16 years, and I thought, tomorrow. I wasn't ready yet. I needed one more night to be certain of myself. What I understood that night, lying in the spare room while the house settled into quiet, was something I hadn't expected to learn from this. I had spent the entire marriage being the steady one. The one who didn't dramatize, who absorbed difficulty, who maintained the level surface. That quality had served us well for a long time. But it had also made me easy to deceive, not because I was naive, but because I had never imagined that my steadiness could be counted on as a form of cover. My reliability was, in the end, the thing she relied on to manage her secret. That realization was more painful than the betrayal itself. The next morning, Marcus left for school at 7:30 and Claudia was making coffee when I came into the kitchen and sat down at the table. The same table where I'd found her phone 3 weeks earlier. I put my own phone on the table between us, open to the photograph of her call log. She looked at it. She looked at me. She set down the coffee pot. 47 calls, I said. July 26th through September 25th. The day I came home. The kitchen was very quiet. Outside the window, the oak tree moved slightly in the October wind. Nathan. I called the number, I said. Rob answered. He suggested I speak to my wife. She sat down, not across from me, at the corner of the table, one seat closer, as if proximity were a form of argument. Her face had the particular quality of someone who has been managing 2 truths simultaneously for a long time and has just been released from the effort. How long were you going to wait? She asked. And then, immediately, I'm sorry. That's not the right question. How long? I said. She pressed her hands flat on the table. It started in August, after the second surgery. I was frightened, Nathan. The doctors were saying things, and you were so far away and she stopped. That's not an excuse. I know it's not. Was he at the hospital? I asked. In the parking lot. Her jaw tightened. Once. I needed to see someone who wasn't afraid. Someone who wasn't looking at me the way everyone was looking at me. Drew saw you, I said. A pause. I know. Marcus told me about the dinner. Her eyes moved briefly, not evasion, more like pain landing. He was at the house, I said. At my table. With my son. I know. Her voice was very quiet. That was wrong. That was the most wrong part of it, and I knew it at the time, and I did it anyway. I looked at her. 16 years sat in that kitchen with us. Every version of ourselves we'd been together. Every night, an argument and reconciliation and ordinary Tuesday, present and useless. You were sick, she said. I was lonely. She said it simply, not as justification. She was too intelligent for that. As explanation, which is a different thing, though in this context the difference felt very small. I know you were lonely, I said. I was in a hospital bed. I was also lonely. She flinched. Is it over? I asked. Yes. It ended before you came home. Ended or paused? She looked at me directly. Ended. I believed her. That was the strange thing. I believed her, and it changed nothing. I need you to understand something, I said. I'm not going to have this conversation repeatedly. I'm not going to process this over months and arrive somewhere we both pretend is healed. I know what I'm going to do, and I wanted to tell you face to face before I do it. She went very still. I'm going to get stronger, I said. And then I'm going to leave. The silence that followed was the longest in 16 years of marriage. Nathan, she said. Please. I came home from 11 weeks in the hospital, I said. I came home to this house, to you, to Marcus. I spent 11 weeks holding on to the idea of coming home. And while I was doing that, I stopped. Let it sit. I need you to understand what you did to that. She was crying, quietly, without performance. the specific crying of someone who has understood something too late. I stood up. I refilled my coffee. I went to the living room. I told Marcus on a Sunday, 6 weeks after the kitchen conversation. By then, I'd regained enough strength to have the talk standing up, which felt important in a way I couldn't fully articulate. We sat on the porch, the one that needed repainting, the one I'd been meaning to get to for 2 years, and I told him as plainly as a father can tell a 14-year-old that his parents were separating, that it wasn't his fault, that both of us loved him in a way that wasn't going to change regardless of what changed between Claudia and me. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Did you know? Before I told you about Rob." "Not then," I said. "Later." He nodded slowly, the nod of a teenager processing something too large for immediate response. "I didn't like him," Marcus said. "Rob, I didn't like how he sat in your chair." I put my hand on his shoulder. We sat on the porch for a while longer without saying much, watching the neighborhood in the pale November light. I moved out in January. A rental on the west side of Fallow Ridge, second floor, a view of the Crestwood water tower that I found unexpectedly calming. I was at full strength by then. Back at work, back in the mornings I recognized as my own. The body had rebuilt itself on its own schedule, and I had followed it and come out the other side. Soren helped me move. Drew came up from Savannah for the weekend, and we unpacked boxes and drank beer, and he said, carefully, that he was sorry he hadn't told me sooner. "You told me when you could," I said. Same thing I'd told Cody, in a different story, in a different town. Some truths are slow. That's just how they are. The divorce was filed in February. Claudia did not contest it. Her attorney and mine negotiated the details with the professional distance of people handling a task that has already been decided. The house on Ember Street, where Marcus would stay, in his room, in his school district, near his friends, was transferred to Claudia. I took the retirement account and a fair division of everything else. Nobody took everything. Nobody won. Marcus spent weekends with me at the Crestwood rental. We developed new routines, the slightly awkward and then comfortable routines of a father and son building something new in a space that didn't have history yet. I cooked things I'd been meaning to learn to cook for years. He told me about school, about a girl he liked, about the horse-related drama among his friends that I found both bewildering and entirely engaging. Saturday mornings, we drove to the farmer's market on Clement Avenue and walked through it slowly and came home with things we didn't plan to buy. Those Saturday mornings were the thing I held on to. Claudia called in March, not about the divorce, which was handled through lawyers by then, just to talk. She said she'd started therapy. She said she thought about the kitchen conversation often. She said she was sorry in the specific, arrived at slowly way that people are sorry when they've had months to understand the full shape of what they did. I listened. I said I appreciated it. I didn't say it changed anything. It didn't. What I understood, by then, was that I didn't hate her. Hatred would have required an ongoing investment in the wound that I wasn't willing to make. What I felt was something more like the specific sadness of recognizing that something real had been carelessly destroyed. Not by a monster, by a frightened person who made a series of choices in a bad period and then had to live in what those choices produced. The sadness was for both of us, in a way. For her, for what she'd thrown away, and for me, for what I'd come home to. What I felt for myself was something cleaner. A man who had been very sick and had come back anyway. Who had found out something terrible and had handled it without losing himself. Who was standing in a second-floor rental watching the Crestwood water tower in the morning light and thinking about what to cook for his son this weekend. That was enough. More than enough. Even now, the detail I return to is the oak tree. I was in the hospital for the whole summer. The tree went green and full, and I missed it entirely. I came home, and it was already turning. There's something in that I've never been able to completely let go of. The idea that the most important things can be happening while you're absent, while you're fighting for something else, while you're doing the only thing you can do. You can't be in two places. You can't hold what you're not there to hold. That's not a failure. It's just the condition of being human, limited, present in one place at a time, trusting the things you've built to hold while you're away. Sometimes they do. Sometimes they don't. What matters is what you do when you come back and find out which. Nathan's story is, on its surface, about a betrayal that happened in his absence. But what makes it worth examining more carefully is what it reveals about the specific vulnerability of a person in crisis, and how that vulnerability can be exploited without malice, which is in some ways worse than exploitation with it. Claudia did not plan to have an affair. The evidence in the story points consistently toward a woman who was genuinely frightened by the severity of Nathan's illness, by the particular loneliness of managing a household and a teenager alone while her husband fought for his life 40 feet away in a hospital room. Fear of loss is one of the most destabilizing emotional states available to humans, and when it runs alongside actual loss of the person's physical and emotional availability, it creates a vacuum. Rob did not manufacture that vacuum. He walked into one that already existed. This is where the story's most uncomfortable truth lives. Claudia's loneliness was real. The circumstances that produced it were real, and none of that changes what she did with it. The tragedy of the story is not that she was a bad person acting from bad motives. It is that a genuinely frightened person made choices that could not coexist with the marriage she was trying to protect. She sought comfort from the fear of losing Nathan in a way that guaranteed she would lose him. That circular logic, the self-defeating nature of the affair as a response to crisis, is the story's deepest irony, and it has no resolution that satisfies. The dinner, Rob at the table, in Nathan's chair, with Marcus present, functions as the story's moral nadir precisely because it removed the affair from the category of private weakness and placed it in the middle of Nathan's family. Marcus was 14. He didn't know what he was witnessing, but he knew something was wrong. "I didn't like how he sat in your chair," is one of the most quietly devastating lines in the narrative, because it reflects a child's accurate reading of a situation he couldn't fully name. Children are the involuntary witnesses of their parents' lives, and what Marcus witnessed in that August dinner was a violation he had no framework to process. The damage to him is not the story's focus, but it is the story's most serious, unresolved consequence. Nathan's arc through the story, the methodical gathering of information, the conversation with Soren, the call to Drew, the single call to Rob's number, is the arc of a man who has learned, in the most literal possible way, not to waste energy. 11 weeks in a hospital teaches you what is worth spending yourself on. Nathan's measured response was not coldness. It was the behavior of a person who had recently inventoried everything that mattered and had very clear priorities as a result. The marriage, in that inventory, did not survive the accounting. What the ending holds, Saturday mornings at the farmer's market, Marcus telling him about school, the water tower visible from the second-floor window, is not happiness exactly, but something more durable than happiness. It is the life a person builds when they have stopped performing contentment and started constructing something that actually fits. Nathan lost the oak tree summer. He lost 16 years and the idea of a family intact. But he came back, which was never guaranteed, and he came back to himself, which is the part that was always his to keep. What I keep thinking about is Nathan in that hospital bed, holding on to the idea of coming home. That image, a sick man sustaining himself on the thought of returning to something, and then the reality of what he returned to. There's a particular cruelty in that gap that no legal settlement or therapy session fully addresses. But here's what strikes me most. Nathan never lost his dignity. Not in the kitchen, not in the conversation with Marcus, not in the final call from Claudia. He moved through the worst year of his life, nearly dying, then discovering the betrayal, without becoming bitter or broken. That kind of quiet strength doesn't make the headlines. It doesn't feel dramatic. But it is, in the end, the thing that carried him through to those Saturday mornings at the farmer's market. And maybe that's the most honest thing this story offers. Not a lesson about betrayal, but a portrait of what it looks like to survive one without letting it define you.